Greetings, everyone. Happy to see everybody. This is a more old-fashioned form of webinar where we actually give people the opportunity to be on screen, which is not our usual. So just keep that in mind that when you want your video off, to make sure it's off and not on when you think it's off. We're really delighted to be able to share this presentation with you, but we're going to give folks just a few minutes to get on, since it's so hard these days going from Zoom to Zoom to Zoom. All right, I'll wait 1 or 2 minutes and then get started.
Great to see folks joining.
Okay. Well, as we continue to let folks in, I just want to welcome you, and perhaps Nami, you have some initial welcomes, and then you can turn it over to me. I realize that that's our usual approach, so I'll turn it over to you first.
Great, thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We hope you had great holidays. It's been a very exciting time for the PCRC with our annual meeting coming up just next week. I hope to see many of you there. And today we're very excited to host a PCRC webinar with Dr. Jonathan Jackson, who will be speaking on recruitment, consents, and retention in ADRD populations. So today looks a little bit different. Attendees are able to unmute themselves and turn on video for the Q&A. And we hope that this will make for a more interactive discussion. Then we'll have Dr. Jackson join us at the bottom of the hour, and he'll be here to help answer your questions. You may also submit your questions in the chat. So today, along with Dr. Jackson, we have Dr. Christine Ritchie, co-chair of the PCRC, on our panel. So I'd like to please turn it over to her and have her say a few words.
So greetings, everybody. Happy Tuesday. And let me just tell you about the backdrop of this webinar and how it came into being. We are, as you know, a community that is very much dedicated to palliative care and to palliative care clinical trials training. And for many of you who've been a member of the PCRC, you've either participated in or been a part of something called the Clinical Trials Intensive. And indeed, we have our PCRC's final Clinical Trials Intensive coming up in April of this year. As a byproduct of the Clinical Trials Intensive, we recently received funding to start something called the Dementia Palliative Care Clinical Trials Training Program, which is a year-long program as opposed to a 3-day program that supports people who are interested in conducting dementia palliative care clinical trials from the time of their sort of twinkle in their eye about a proposal they want to put in to actually helping them get their proposal in. And as part of that, we have an august group of faculty members from around the country. If this is of interest to you, by the way, there will be opportunities to apply in coming years. But what we also have is, as part of our faculty, as part of our faculty, we have just some amazing people from around the country. And one of those amazing people is Jonathan Jackson. And Jonathan Jackson gave us this lecture that you're going to be hearing about recruitment retention and consent, or excuse me, recruitment and retention. And we were so taken by it, and so many people really appreciated it who are part of our dementia palliative care clinical trials training program, that he agreed for us to share it with you, and then to answer questions at the conclusion of what initially will be a recording, and then you'll get to hear directly from Jonathan himself. So let me just tell you a few words about Dr. Jackson. Dr. Jackson is the Executive Director of Community Access, Recruitment, and Engagement Research Center, or what's called the CARE Research Center here at Mass General Hospital. He's an Assistant Professor of Neurology at Harvard Medical School. And what CARE seeks to do is to investigate the impact of diversity and inclusion on the quality of human subjects research, and leverages deep community entrenchment to build trust and overcome barriers to clinical trials participation. Dr. Jackson's research focuses specifically on inequities in clinical settings that affect underserved populations, and he's received generous funding for this work from the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research, Mass General Hospital, the National Institutes of Health, and that included an NIH Pioneer Award to advance this work. Dr. Jackson received his doctoral degree in psychological and brain sciences in 2014, and he also conducts research as a cognitive neuroscientist, investigating the early detection of Alzheimer's disease, particularly in the absence of overt memory problems. He has become a well-known representative to underserved communities and dozens of affiliated organizations, especially regarding participation in clinical research. And he serves in advisory capacity for a number of organizations that are focused on equity in clinical research, has written guidance for a number of local, statewide, national organizations, and has been an incredible resource to us at the PCRC and through the Dementia Palliative Care Clinical Trials Program by giving us very concrete, thoughtful perspectives on representation in research and how it is an equity issue. So with that, I will turn it over to Naomi to get our recording started. And then at the bottom of the hour, we'll have a Q&A time that involves Dr. Jackson himself.
Can everyone see?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Jackson. It is so wonderful to be joining you virtually and remotely from a recorded presentation. I'm sorry that I won't be able to be there in person with you all. I promised my daughter 6 months ago that I would attend a viola concert that she's having tomorrow night. But I will be there with you down at the Rizzo Center by midweek in person, and I will be available virtually after this presentation to answer any questions that you might have as things kind of move on with this talk. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today is optimizing recruitment, consent, and retention. By way of introduction, my name is Jonathan Jackson, and I am the director of the Community Access, Recruitment, and Engagement Research Center. We are designed to try to help people understand a kind of quantified science of what recruitment, engagement, and retention looks like, particularly for marginalized and minoritized populations. I've done about 20 years of research in the dementia field, so a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about today should be relevant for whatever study that is that you're trying to design. Let's go ahead and jump in with this lovely quote from Lasagna back in the early 70s, who wrote that the incidence of patient availability sharply decreases when a trial begins and returns to its original level just as soon as that trial is completed. Another way of saying that is we as researchers have no idea when or where patients come from that sign up for our studies. We like to think that we do, but we usually don't. And so there are best practices that we need to be thinking about, and that things that we can implement even in a palliative care setting that may be relevant and useful when it comes to doing this work in a detailed and thoughtful way. Another way of thinking about this problem is trying to understand what differentiates the event that the kind of events or structures that you see on the left versus the one that you see on the right. So these are two of my own pictures that I took from two community events that were designed to promote brain and mental well-being in Black communities in Boston. So these events took place within just about a mile of each other in the same part of the city that was designed to reach the same community of Black individuals in Boston. And as you can see in one event that was organized by my team on the left, you can see that there is an enormous amount of engagement. This was, of course, pre-COVID, so you're not seeing a lot of masking there. However, what you see here in another pre-COVID event on the right is just the opposite, where there was a group that anticipated a much larger response. And unfortunately, although they expected a turnout of about 300, about 7 people showed up. They were outnumbered 2 to 1 by the catering staff. So are there any other kinds of leading or concurrent indicators that will mean that we should be able to either anticipate or predict or understand why we're not necessarily having the kind of impact recruitment or engagement that we're looking for within certain populations? Put another way, there are major consequences when we fail to recruit representatively. If you are looking just for brown faces to help you win over NIH, then this talk may not necessarily be for you. And the reason why is because of what we see here in this really, really lovely slide from Carrie Gleason and colleagues, published back in 2019, late 2019 in Alzheimer's and Dementia. And what we see here is that the NAC data set, so one of our largest data sets in dementia care, we see that Black people are progressing from mild cognitive impairment to frank dementia at a much slower rate relative to white individuals in this cross-sectional analysis. And anybody who knows anything about ethno-racial disparities in Alzheimer's or dementia more broadly would say that this does not necessarily make sense. So what's going on here? It turns out that if you just thought about ethno-racial identity, you would say, well, I guess the disparity is in the opposite direction of what I would have thought. However, it turns out that there's something called a healthy worker bias. In other words, many of the ethno-racial minorities came from a community sample where there's a lower base rate of dementia, and many of the white identifying majority population individuals came from a memory clinic where, of course, there's going to be a higher base rate of dementia. So going back to this graph with this information in mind, what we see here is not necessarily a disparity in either direction. What we see here is a comparison between apples and oranges. We've got 2 groups that are not necessarily able to be directly compared, commingling within the same data set. So the reason why it's important to think about representation is not just for the social justice of it all, but recognizing that a lack of representation destabilizes science. It limits our external validity and generalizability. But as you could have seen from the previous slide, there are also crucial limitations on construct, internal, and statistical conclusion validity that undermine causal inference in our work. So we need to be thoughtful about what diversity means, what representation means, and who it is that we're trying to incorporate or bring into our research samples. Now, the big question is, why can't we recruit diverse populations? What makes this so difficult? Turns out that it doesn't really matter what field of study you're in or what you're studying, or whether you're doing in-home visits versus bringing people to an academic medical center. You're going to have some combination of these 11 reasons. What's difficult, though, is not why we're struggling to recruit, to retain, or engage, or even consent people to research, but recognizing that with limited time and resources, we don't know which of these 11 factors we need to be concentrating on for any particular study team, any particular department. So what my group at the Care Research Center has done is we have decided to create a more of a workflowed selection representation of this. So you've got these same 11 reasons right here above my head. And it turns out that you can turn that into an ordered workflow where you start by defining a sampling frame, moving through these decisional stages that research participants need to navigate, and then moving into our area of the study design. What's crucial to know is that in most cases, the only parts that we have detailed protocols are these 3 that you see here in the middle of the triangle workflow here that are not in bold. So screening, enrollment, setting, and implementation, we've got great protocols for. Everything else that you see in bold is usually left out of the picture. And that is why it is so darn hard to get a representative, sustainable sample in our research studies. So let's walk through some of these stages very, very briefly. I've only got about a few minutes to kind of go through all of these things together. But let's start with that sampling frame. And so the first question is, what do I mean by a sampling frame? Now, a sampling frame is something that I like to present as an alternative to your catchment area. So many of us who have written and received grants have had to say, well, we are looking for this kind of older adult population, or this many individuals who are in a palliative care setting. And we'll say, we are residing within, let's say, the Chapel Hill area, and there are 120,000 older adults that seem to fit these criteria. That is your catchment. Unfortunately, that is not going to ever be your sampling frame. There is no chance that with whatever study that you're trying to recruit for, that you're going to be able to reach all 120,000 of those individuals in the broader Chapel Hill area. So what you've got to do is you've got to create or construct a necessarily biased subset of that catchment area. So if you're not going to reach all 120,000 of those individuals in Chapel Hill, who are you going to be able to reach up to? If you can reach 100 of them, are they going to be a representative 100? And if not, why not? So asking your questions about what that biased subset is going to look like. And so some of the bias, while it is necessary because of the recruitment and selection criteria for study, some of it is not necessary. So you need to clearly define your catchment area and then try to figure out who is actually able to participate, who will be eligible, how can they get involved. Because this will have downstream consequences, not just for this section of the ordered workflow, but moving down through the remainder of the list. So the more clearly you can define the subset of your catchment area that can and will participate in your study, the easier it will be to design some sort of materials that can target them. So an example of your catchment area would be to say, these 120,000 individuals in Chapel Hill, we want to over-recruit Black and African-American individuals. Unfortunately, that's still not quite a sampling frame. So instead of just saying, I want to reach Black and African-American individuals, which Black and African-American individuals do you want to reach? Do you want to reach those who are regularly attend church? Do you want to reach those who are within a 20-minute drive of your research center? Do you want to reach those who have the ease and facilities for you to do in-person home visits, because that's going to be a necessarily biased subset of that broader set of individuals. And so once you have a clear idea of who those individuals are, where they are from a geographic perspective, it'll be much easier to identify what recruitment tools that you want to use and to maximize that kind of recruitment that you're looking for. So the sampling frame is always the best place to start when you're thinking about recruitment, because so much of what comes from kind of downstream will hinge on your assumptions about who can participate in your study. So the next step in this ordered workflow, where we don't usually have a lot of detail, is how do we raise awareness? We've got to remember that all of us, you, me, anybody who can hear my voice at this point in time, is deeply weird. And if you need any evidence of that, think about whether your parents or your kids or even your partner or your spouse has a clear understanding of what you do for a living. Like, do they really know? And these are individuals who are highly motivated in many cases to understand the work that we do. If we are going out to talk to strangers who don't necessarily have a clear understanding of clinical research, even in a palliative care setting, then we have to recognize that there's an awareness problem that we need to kind of overcome here. So let's think about how we're going to raise awareness, who we're going to try to recruit or reach. So if you want certain patients in your study, especially if, for these kinds of research designs, you have to recognize that you're also going to need to talk to certain clinicians, nurses, front desk staff, and of course, patient families and spousal dyads. So make sure that when you are advertising the study, when you're developing these flyers and these pamphlets, that you are speaking to everybody that will be involved in making that decision. So especially in the dementia space, especially in the palliative care for dementia space, we already know that we're going to be talking to more than just the patient, but making sure that we have materials that frame the study from a point of value for those individuals is going to be absolutely crucial. So make sure that at this stage, keep your messaging super simple. When you have a flyer or any kind of digital media that you might be using to advertise, many of us make the mistake of trying to put everything that we could possibly want to share in one document. And unfortunately, that's not particularly effective. So one clear way of helping drive that home is, if you think about a flyer that you've designed, and maybe you've put it up on a big bulletin board at your university or at your academic medical center, I want you to think about how often you look at other flyers that are also advertising for research studies. My guess is that unless you know the person or unless you know something about the research area that's being studied, you probably walked on by. And that's because these flyers are not usually designed to raise awareness. So, one example of that is contained here. So if you think about these two flyer designs, one of them is designed to be eye-catching, to generate some like a bit of a curiosity gap, and to have very, very simple messaging. While the other one, unfortunately, contains a little bit too much information. So although both studies are equally interesting, equally compelling, they are not necessarily equally well designed at raising awareness. So keep in mind that if you have a study flyer, the only thing that you can do is raise awareness. You cannot necessarily engage. You cannot necessarily directly recruit. That is what conversations, phone calls, and research pamphlets like bifold or trifold pamphlets are for. So keep in mind that if you're raising awareness, keep your messaging simple. Now, moving on to this stage of thinking about trust and engagement, you've got to make sure that you're providing some kind of return of value to prospective patients or referrers or their families. So even for people who don't enroll, there needs to be something that they get out of talking to you, even if it's just a little bit of information about what's going on in palliative care settings around dementia. If you are not necessarily the PI of a study, it helps to have the PI involved. The person who is on the hook for maintaining study deliverables, having them take the time to talk to individuals who may be particularly interested, it really makes a huge amount of difference. This is the stage where it really helps to have that diversity on your team. You can usually build a sampling frame, you can usually build some awareness without that. But once you start trying to build trust or engagement among your cohorts, among your prospective cohort, that diversity tends to help. One caveat is diversity is not a kind of a be-all or an end-all. If you can't look or if you can't identify that kind of diversity on your team for one reason or another, there's usually not many good reasons, but let's say that you've got a few. Looking for local representation and local voices, hiring a local team will get you some of the distance that is often covered by diversity. So keep in mind that when you're doing trust and engagement, you're going to need to try to design for multiple touch points. Most people are not going to opt into your research study the very first time that you talk about it with them. So make sure that you have enough time and enough differentiated activity to fully engage a relatively research naive population with about three time points. One way of doing that is this last bullet point here about creating a curiosity gap. Get people wondering and excited about your work. One easy way of doing that is to design a talk that highlights kind of the understanding of the field. Let's say you want to talk about dementia. Let's say you want to talk about palliative care. And then you've got a research question that is a nuanced examination of a tiny part of that. Making that research question accessible and easily understood by research prospective participants, as well as their families, is a great recruitment tool, as well as a retention tool for your research studies. So keeping in mind that there are lots and lots of ways to do engagement. You can do direct community events, you can do digital and social media, you can even create support groups. Remember to be creative and be responsive to that narrowly defined sampling frame when you're doing this kind of work. Moving on to literacy and motivation. Obviously, this is a great way to address the curiosity gap by talking about the way that your research study is designed. Try to hold information sessions so that people can learn more. This is where it's helpful to have not just that study flyer, but like a bifold or a trifold pamphlet. But keeping in mind that you need to make sure that you're using plain language on all of your documents, including your informed consent documents. So many IRBs are moving to try to support plain language in the writing of your documents. So you can certainly turn to them for some support. If not, I am available. I will be available virtually at the end of this talk and then later this week, so you can talk to me about how to do these things. There are lots of readability calculators that you can use online that are free of charge. Keeping in mind that when, of course, this is already implied in a palliative care setting, but trying to address families if you can, rather than individual participants, is going to be a key way of motivating a larger group of individuals to consider participation in your study and to think carefully about consent. This is a part that will take a lot of time. either to kind of build that engagement, to explain what research is and what the study is going to be doing, simplifying your documents to make the consent process as easy as possible. Obviously, thinking about digital methods where available, keeping in mind, of course, that the digital divide that many people talk about is not quite as black and white as some people have access to the internet and other people's don't. It's more about whether you have designed digital tools that are mobile friendly, because a lot of these individuals that we claim don't have access, they're just not interested in using a traditional laptop or desktop, but they still have smartphones that are capable of accessing the internet. So moving ahead, we want to think about the actual study design. When you are doing the kind of an initial intake and screening, it is really crucial to ensure that you're reimbursing for as many expenses as you can. This isn't just about reimbursing for parking or like an Uber ride, but thinking about dependent care, time off work, whether these individuals are having to go out of pocket in some way that we're not, documenting. Ideally, you have a study design that allows you to partner with local clinics for routine or any kind of screening work, making sure that we have reviewed our selection criteria because many of these can be eliminated because they've just been carried over from previous studies. Where they can't be eliminated, it's vital that you make it as precise as possible so that there isn't necessarily a lot of wiggle room that can be left to a research assistant or a screening physician, because that is where we tend to get differential rates of passing of study criteria based on things like ethnoracial identity. If you can create multiple strong returns of value, a minimum of individualized return of results, these are the things that really make a difference in terms of not just getting people to the table, but making sure that they can participate actively over the course of the study. And that if they ultimately screen fail, that we have alternative participation options available to those individuals. So they can serve as study ambassadors, maybe they can qualify for a different study, but keeping those individuals engaged and involved is really crucial. When it comes to retention, this is where you're going to find out if you've got that strong return of value. Doing things like semi-regular newsletters, trying to make sure that you are paying individuals anytime that you are formally reaching out to them, but staying in touch and staying connected to them in between those moments is also really, really crucial. So make sure that if your participants can describe the study and its importance, we know from nursing science from 25 years ago that this is the #1 way to predict whether participants will stay involved in your study long term, if they can describe the study in its own words, in their own words and its importance. Minimizing staff turnover, especially for those high touch positions like RAs, is another great way, because most individuals will be connected to somebody on your study team and not you as the PI. And so a combination of these strategies is likely to be super additive. So doing the most that you can is always going to be more effective. So overall advice, just a few quick points. #1, you probably have some kind of awareness problem that needs fixing. People probably don't know about your study or what your study is or why it's important. So make sure that you're addressing that as early in this decisional pipeline as you can. Keeping in mind that you've got to do new things. However, make sure that you're not just sort of blindly copying the advice from someone else. Keeping in mind things relative to patient centricity is usually vital, but when it comes to trusting the experts here, you as the PI, you as the study leadership are probably not the experts. Your clinical research coordinators and your research assistants are the experts. They are in high touch positions all day. Maybe they've come from another research setting where they've done even more of this, but trust them, look to them to help you identify barriers and whether potential solutions are effective. And then of course, this is not necessarily a black box. You can measure things. But the final piece of advice that I have for you is to make sure that your team remains as diversified as you can at all levels. So making sure that you're looking for those local voices, not just the ones that reflect the group that you want, because that rapport and that authenticity really depends on building a team that can connect with the group that you have, of course, well defined in your sampling frame. So that's the end of my talk. I'm available for questions. I will be magically wearing a different outfit, but I promise it's still me. Many thanks to the CARE Research Center and to Grant Support for allowing me to be part of this particular faculty. And I look forward to talking with you all here shortly. I'm going to stop recording and
Thanks so much, Dr. Jackson. I benefit from that conversation and from your words every time I hear it. I always get new tips. So as promised, Dr. Jackson is here with us on the webinar and is ready to take your questions. There are two ways you can do this. You can put your question in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself and ask Dr. Jackson your questions then. So if you do the latter, just raise your hand and that way we can make sure and call on you. Any questions for Dr. Jackson? Okay, so we have one from Dr. Beckelman. What did you mean by 3 touch points during recruitment?
Hi, everyone. I know it feels like you probably just listened to me talking for the last 25 minutes, but it was a recording, so I'm going to be playing a little bit of catch up here. When I talk about the 3 touch points during recruitment, this is actually a term borrowed from marketing research, where in order to get somebody to buy something, you need to be able to reach them at multiple time points. It turns out that the same philosophy is true in research. Typically, most individuals who are willing to engage in a research studies have already previously had some kind of touch point, usually referring clinician who is a co-I or a PI on a study. Maybe they have previously participated in some other research opportunity, but making sure that you have those 3 touch points. So for people who are naive to research, that usually means raising awareness, in which case they might see a study flyer, maybe attending an engagement event, and then providing them with opportunity to read a study pamphlet. So those would be 3 touch points that would then prime somebody who is research naive to present for a pre-screening or screening. So you need to make sure that that there are multiple ways that people can hear about and connect to your team and your study. Otherwise, you're going to be ultimately just reliant on a population that is very, very well connected or otherwise very socially privileged to participate, and that is going to really have some downstream ramifications on the generalizability of your study.
Great. While we're waiting for other questions to come in, one question that I had had to do with how you recommend tracking where study participants are coming from. If you have any sort of tips on how best to sort of pay attention to like where you're not, where someone is, we're not getting traction, or where you might be getting traction.
Yeah, so there are a few ways of trying to track where participants are coming from. One is by tracking aspects of the, I'm going to give kind of like the fancy answers and then I'll go back and unpack them. One is by tracking the social graph. Another is by tracking opportunities temporally. And third would be by opportunities, in terms of tracking opportunities in terms of referral sources. So the last one is the most common, where you ask somebody how they heard about a study. Did they hear about it from a friend? Did they see a social media post? Did a referring clinician recommend that they participate? It turns out that that is good some of the time, but often individuals, because of the 3 touch points that I mentioned, usually they will have needed to have heard about it from multiple channels. And that can make it a little bit difficult to understand or really localize which one of those referral sources is really pulling kind of the duty. So what you really want to do is to potentially track in terms of mapping a social graph, which is a little bit more intensive. Social graph is just a combination of social networks that you kind of stack on top of each other. In most cases, some individual or some organization will be responsible for a majority of the recruitment. So usually you'll find some enthusiastic person who works for maybe a patient advocacy groups, who goes and tells all of her connections and colleagues, and that will drive recruitment for a period of time. The third thing that I would recommend is to potentially recruit by temporality. And this is something that I didn't have time to put in my remarks, which is that most research studies have 3 waves of recruitment that they deal with. That first wave is the one that we usually plan for. We get that big spike of activity right at the beginning of the study. And then if you don't have a plan after that, then you're just kind of left floundering for some cases, years. by engaging individuals who are already proximal to your system, so individuals within your health system, individuals who have been previously engaged in research, you can get that middle wave, that second wave of recruitment that is likely to be less of a spike than that initial wave, but may last longer. Then that third wave is going to be a consequence of the depth of your community engagement plan that's a little bit more kind of a slower burn. So those are 3 ways of tracking recruitment. Again, that first way of trying to track recruitment source is the easiest to implement, but it may be the least informative in terms of trying to drive your recruitment activities.
Yeah, really nice. I really appreciate the comment around the sort of social graph. So there are 2 questions slash comments in the chat that are kind of connected to each other, and they relate to how to deal with busy, overworked, exhausted clinicians and how to facilitate recruitment from them.
Yes, and so then I want to hear from Joan Carpenter, who I see has a hand up.
Yes, and her apparently her question relates to that, so maybe she can amplify
Okay,
after
yeah.
you start the
Joan,
answer.
did you have anything extra to add on to that?
Well, first I want to say thank you so much for this, because it resonated with me when we make all these plans for recruitment and screening and enrollment, and we write these elaborate protocols out and standard operating procedures, and then when it doesn't work, we're just scrambling and kind of doing what we can. So what I'm getting at is that I recruit from nursing homes, and I am recruiting from multiple states, so I can't do as much engagement as I would want. And similar to what Seiko was saying, these are overworked clinicians. We are completely relying on them to help us spread the word, and we're struggling. So, but I'll let you start, and then I'll kind of clarify some additional, points that I might want to understand more.
Yeah, so if you remember my recruitment funnel, the upside down triangle that I presented, there was a key point in the middle that was called equity and return of value. Many of us, when I present something like equity, you think, oh, well, I want to make sure that these disadvantaged participants have the equal opportunity to participate as these other ones who are more advantaged. It turns out that when you think about equity, when you think about return of value, that is something that is applicable to all stakeholders who touch your study. And so where this, I think, is the most evident for most PIs and researchers is in those referring clinicians. So there are a few ways of going about it, but the bottom line is that, Seiko, your comment was spot on. Clinicians, especially primary care, they're overworked, they're exhausted, they have no time to do this. And so what you have to do is you're going to have to engage in a handful of strategies and find what works. So you're going to have to find that return of value, that thing that either a group or even a single individual clinician within an institution appreciates and really resonates with. So sometimes that will be, maybe you'll find one clinician who really wants to engage in science, and you can pay for a little bit of their time to be protected as a co-investigator. And this is going to need to be done at the individual practice or site level. So you can't necessarily hope that if you get one co-I at a community health center, that will transfer to all of the sites that you may be recruiting from. Another thing that you might be able to do is to help them manage some of their complex caseloads. So if you can make some of your experts, your expert clinicians or scientists available for a couple of hours a month to help them recognize, diagnose, manage some of the complex cases that they don't necessarily have the subspecialty training to maybe either recognize or appropriately manage on their own. That is another incentive that is often very useful. Third, you might just find somebody within this particular network that is passionate about the cause, passionate about the topic that you're investigating, maybe passionate about the research method or methodology. And for those individuals, they are, what I call true believers. And having even one of those individuals within a system will facilitate access and referrals throughout that system. And so what it comes down to is that you're going to have to find some manner of buy-in. If it seems like none of the clinicians are interested in what you're saying, then you're going to have to go to other people within that system. So it might be time to approach the nurses. It might be time to approach the front desk staff. Well, no matter who you end up involving, what is really key is finding something of value to that individual or to that small group. And if you can find even one person to champion your study, that really does make it easier to get other individuals to potentially refer and help you recruit. But there is no magic method. There is no one thing that you can offer that will guarantee that suddenly all the referring clinicians will forget their fatigue and their busyness and their tiredness and kind of all throw in for your study. You're going to have to work. You're going to have to try to sell them on the value of the study, and you're going to have to find some element that makes it worth their while. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's prestige, sometimes it's advice. Sometimes, maybe you've got their favorite nurse on board. And so you'll have to find that way in. And unfortunately, this is one of those things where it often takes time and managing and building individual relationships to make this work. So what I would recommend is if you have a previous set of sites that you've worked with, make sure you stay in touch with them between studies so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I know that that's not the most satisfying answer, but that's about as close as it gets in terms of kind of generalizable feedback. Seiko, I see that your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is very helpful. But I still have some more questions, but I'm gonna ask John, did you get everything, or if you have some more questions first?
No, thanks. Go ahead, Seiko.
Okay, thank you. So I may be getting into the weeds, but
Let's do it.
one thing you mentioned about the paying for the participants or clinicians to buy their time, and I have tried that, but it also has a lot of challenges. One clinician needs to, it is very difficult to buying out their time to, doing the research. And it's also very difficult to write it in as a part of the proposal and get approval. But usually, if you write the proposal, then it may be hopefully funded in the 2-3 years later. And how can I work it out? So it is very, very challenging. And there are some, luckily that there is some clinician who is really interested and championing the subject of the research, but they really want to participate. I totally get it, but they cannot. So if there's any more additional suggestions, if you have, I would really appreciate it.
Yeah, so I think my last suggestion is unfortunately the nuclear option, which means you might have to find some new colleagues because it sounds like a lot of those pressures are not necessarily ones designed by the colleagues, but the system that they have to work in. I know for a fact that some primary care and some sort of general practitioners, it's very, very difficult for them to either buy out the time or to have those opportunities. If you approach a different health system or even a different small group practice, they may have a bit more flexibility. And so unfortunately, that does mean that you're going to have to kind of go and build those relationships up again. But if there are these systemic challenges, one of the things that I think we've all learned in the last few years is you can't necessarily take a set of systemic failures and put that on individuals and expect them to kind of elegantly navigate that. So if there are all of these challenges to having refer clinicians set up and support your study, that sounds like a systemic problem. And if you can't change that system, you might need to move into a new environment. And find some colleagues with a bit more flexibility. And so again, what you can also do at the same time is maybe set up some long-term conversations with that health system's leaders to make sure that those referring physicians may have the flexibility to participate and support research, especially if they are passionate about it. But in the short term, you're just going to have to find some new buddies.
Thank you very much.
And you've probably seen this in the chat, Jonathan, that Olga also sort of mentioned some of the similar challenges that she's had in the hospice world. Seems like your advice is relevant there. Any other reflections on hospice per se that you've encountered?
I'd love to hear a little more from Olga, but what I will say is when it comes to home hospice and potentially getting buy-in, this is one of those cases where the return of value is almost always going to be predicated on building that relationship. So you can come in and you can offer the moon and all the stars in the sky, but if they don't know you, they don't trust you, it doesn't matter. And so when it comes to home hospice, and this is actually true for skilled nursing facilities as well, you have got to make sure that you have a plenty of time to build and sustain those relationships. And if you don't have the ability to do that, then you need to get somebody with you need to get somebody that you can name as like a co-investigator on your study who already has those relationships and can help you get your way in. So what my guess is the challenge that you're facing is that whatever home hospice service or organization that you may be working with just doesn't have that level of investment in your research. And so that means that it's usually falling down to a few probably overworked individuals who may not necessarily have the capacity or the bandwidth to facilitate recruitment to your study. So I would say that seems like a relationship challenge more than a providing incentives challenge. And I would really strongly recommend going back and trying to maybe take like a step back for up to maybe 6 weeks and just meeting weekly with leadership, with hospice nurses, with hospice care coordinators, and trying to build out a little bit more of that social graph so that you understand who's making the decisions, who's really excited. And once you have a better characterization of that world, they'll be able to point you in the right direction of who's actually got the bandwidth to participate.
Awesome. And it looks like Arissa has her hand up.
Hi, Dr. Jackson. Thank you so much
Hi.
for this talk. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So I'm an RC at Harborview, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about trust building tools in the context of like the 3 touch points in the context of patients who face major barriers to care and communication, such as unhoused patients, those who have limited access to phones and email, who we might not be able to have extended communication and retention with. So what does that look like? Should the 3 touch points be during the same hospitalization?
So to answer your last question first, yes. They should be separable. They should be separate touch points. But if you can build that rapport over a single visit or a single hospitalization, to do it. The second thing that I think is really important to emphasize is, especially when it comes to populations who are by intention or design, that they are marginalized. So we're not just talking about marginalization of ethno-racial diversity, but also all sorts of populations, including the unhoused. That's where trust needs to take a back seat to flexibility and empowerment. If you can build in systems of your research approach that allow for more flexibility, then you're likely to get a bit more buy-in. If you can also build in systems of empowerment, which goes right hand in hand with flexibility. So if somebody is empowered, they can engage with you as a research partner or participant on their terms and on their timetable. Then you don't have to worry about the problem of trust. Something that I often say in my talks, and I be honest, I don't know if I said it in my recorded comments or not, is trust is hard to win and very easily lost. So if you're going to be predicating an entire research protocol, 5 years of your life, potentially on trust, then that can be a very, very fraught position, not just for you, but for the people who are participating in your research study. So certainly hope for trust, but plan for flexibility and empowerment. Really maximize those touch points. Make sure that one of your 3 touch points emphasizes heavily that return of value for the individual or whomever they might be, whomever they might care about. So make sure that, that I think would be the best final touch point, is to emphasize a return of value and principles of equity. But again, worry less about trust, worry more about making sure that they are empowered to participate according to their situation.
Thank you so much.
Looks like Seiko has one additional question, which is, do you have any additional or different advice to recruit patients and family caregivers with dementia? Specifically, what are strategies to recruit family caregivers as a surrogate of persons with dementia? And maybe this can be our final question.
Yeah, please go ahead to, some people raise hands, so please go ahead because I already asked a question.
Oh, okay. Oh my gosh, look at all these raised hands. So sorry,
There's
I
a
missed
bunch
them.
coming in here at the end. So why don't I let me answer the other question in the chat. We'll do the two hands that are raised, and then I'll come back to Seiko's question at the end if we have time. So David, to very quickly answer your question, what did we have to do to have so many people show up to our engagement event versus the other one, which was the local chapter of the Alzheimer's Association? What we ended up doing was we met people where they were at, literally. We made sure that the event was in a place that was heavily trafficked. We made sure that the topic was fully reflected what the community was asking for at that moment, whereas the other event was the 7th iteration of the same kind of tired proposal about trying to talk about memory loss. And it turns out that if you meet people where they are, you can still talk about memory loss. You can just do it in a context that is a bit more dynamic and responsive. It turns out that when it comes to things like raising awareness, advertising, we didn't do anything differently between the two events. We did flyers, we did radio campaigns, we did some newspaper advertisements. What made all the difference was crafting a message that resonated with the community at that specific moment in time. And it turns out that there's no substitute for that. Apart from having somebody on our team, which we did, who was local to that community. So I am a Black person. This was a Black event, but I am not from Boston. When we hired a Black person from Boston who hailed from these communities, she was incredibly effective in crafting that message. And so that's why I often say, if you can't hire somebody who reflects the community that you're trying to recruit, hire somebody local that understands that community, because in a pinch that will work well. Okay, Sheena?
It is. Have you
Yes.
ever used one of your engagement recruitment events to actually, especially when dealing with communities of color, like to acknowledge any past kind of abuses that community maybe experienced, so they understand that that's happened? And how did that work?
Yeah, so actually, I this is great, very timely, because every February I give a talk for the last 8 or 9 years. That's called Black Lives Matter and Health Too. And basically, I just stepped through Harriet Washington's Medical Apartheid. I don't know if you're familiar with that book. It is a tough read. But what I do is I basically say, oh, let's talk about Tuskegee. Let's talk about Henrietta Lacks. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's really get into the history. And I present like 8 or 9 rapid fire events of medical abuses against mostly Black communities, but also prisoners and Latinx and Japanese Americans back in World War II. So what happens is, and I'll tell you exactly what is likely to happen to you. The community loves it. Researchers hate it. Because researchers feel that it makes them feel more culpable, and like people are not going to trust them ever again. But the reality is that lay community really, really love it, because it gives them a chance to feel validated and to really understand the depth of this mistrust, this queasy feeling that they have when they have to interact and engage with the healthcare environment and establishment. The other thing that I would also recommend is that you often get like this split when you present to communities of color, where some people are really, really interested in talking about that history, and other people are like, history is history. That's not why I don't trust the establishment. I don't trust because I went to the hospital 3 years ago, and this is how I was treated. So what I've often done is I've combined that talk with like an open town hall, where we can talk about some of the kind of the concurrent ongoing barriers that prevent communities from either seeking care or seeking research opportunities from specific establishments, and then creating an action plan to go back and re-engage with those communities, either like after 6 months or after a year, to look for evidence of accountability and progress. So that has actually been incredibly effective here in Boston and back when I lived in St. Louis. And so I think that similar process of acknowledging past harm, acknowledging current harm, creating a plan, making yourselves as researchers and clinicians vulnerable to towards any kind of measures of community accountability, that is going to go a much longer way towards building trust than maybe trying to recruit somebody from for specific protocols. Christine, do I have time to answer Seiko's last question or no?
I thought there was one other person with their hand raised, or did that hand go down?
They lowered their hand and I don't remember.
Oh, they lowered their hand. Okay,
Olga,
fine.
you just came off mute. Was it your question?
I had a comment, but I'll wait until Seiko's question if we have time. Otherwise, I'm okay. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Olga. So
Okay,
go ahead.
So yes, so briefly, when you are trying to engage or enroll individuals living with dementia, so obviously there are kind of the standard IRB regulations, which actually point you in the right direction. So as we are dealing with a population that is less and less able to provide consent, we start to use dynamic versions of assent for those individuals of sort of diminished cognitive capacity. In addition to that, and this is where taking an equity lens and taking the kind of the lens of inclusion that we often use when we're approaching, say, communities of color, it really gets you a long way towards engaging with dyads or patients and families who are living with and managing dementia. It turns out that trying to engage more of the family in those early processes is really, really crucial. And what you can do is just frame it as a point to learn more and make sure that everybody every stakeholder, every person that's involved has a chance to ask questions, has a chance to participate, and has a chance to offer their feedback. Almost always, and I think everybody here will probably agree, that if you are going to be talking to people living with dementia and their care partners, it is never an easy task to kind of go in and administer like a 10-minute survey and then get back out. You're always going to be committing yourselves to a much longer and larger conversation. So what you can do is just plan around that and make those your touch points. Because everybody's got a story, they're going to want to share their story. And what you can do is you can say, this is what I'm interested in. I am interested in your experiences around this particular topic. I want to know whether, rethinking aspects of palliative care, rethinking aspects of diagnosing and managing and treating dementia, rethinking the way that we construct these medical visits, either with or without paying attention to the person living with dementia. In the vast majority of the cases of the work that I think that all of you are doing, there is going to be a component which is designed to either reveal some aspect of the experience of living with or managing dementia that has not previously been acknowledged, or perhaps, if you're lucky, intervening on one of those difficult situations. That is all the return of value that someone's going to need. And if you really want to sweeten the pot, give them some time to talk. Just let them talk. And so having some pamphlets so that they can share it with other people who may not be present, or people who want to kind of go back and read over it again. This may be the person living with dementia. This may be a larger cadre of care partners that are not necessarily be able to be present with you at the time. Making sure that those are at a very readable level. So I would recommend no higher than 5th grade. What's nice is that with the advent of ChatGPT, you can actually go on to OpenAI and ask it to write an informed consent document at a 5th grade level for somebody engaging in a palliative care study of Alzheimer's disease, and it will write one, and you can sort of just tweak it. So if you feel that something like this is really, really hard for you, there are freely available AI tools that will design this. We've actually started incorporating this into our consultations. So again, make it readable, make it accessible, be inclusive, give people a chance to kind of talk, and really emphasize the passion that you as a researcher are bringing to this topic, what it is that you're hoping to shed a light on that has gone kind of previously unnoticed. And that should be sufficient to kind of build this culture of inclusivity around individuals living with dementia and their kind of care plan and their care families.
Wow. So many great insights. Thanks so much for your time, Jonathan, and for imparting all this great wisdom to all of us. Really, really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for participating.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. And to the audience, please do stay tuned for that post survey. Have a great month. We'll see you in February for Implementation Science with Stephen Bartels. Take care.